A group of scientists opened a 2,000-year-old tomb expecting to confirm everything we thought we knew about the Zapotec people. What they found instead broke that story into pieces. If ancient bones can rewrite a nation's identity, then stay close, because by the end of this video, you might question everything you were taught about where your own ancestors really came from. For centuries, the story of the Zapotec people felt simple, clean, settled, like a chapter already closed in a textbook. They were one of the great civilizations of ancient Mexico. They built the mountaintop city of Monte Albán. They carved stone monuments. They created one of the earliest writing systems in the Americas. And for a long time, historians believed they knew exactly how this story began. The common version goes like this. Long ago, a single group of people settled in the Oaxaca Valley. Over time, they grew into a powerful, unified civilization. They stayed largely the same. One people, one bloodline, one unbroken line of ancestry stretching back thousands of years, untouched by outside influence. It's a comforting story. Clean beginnings, clear identity, a straight line from the past to the present. But history is rarely that simple. And when scientists finally got the chance to read the Zapotec story, not from stone carvings, but from their actual DNA, the clean version started to crack. To understand why this discovery matters so much, you have to understand what Monte Albán really was. This wasn't just a village, it was one of the first true cities in the Americas, built on top of a mountain, deliberately around 2,500 years ago. Imagine the effort that took. No modern machines, no trucks, just human hands, flattening a mountaintop to build a capital in the sky. From up there, the Zapotec could see for miles, farmland below, trade routes stretching outward, rival settlements in the distance. This wasn't a random location, it was a statement, a message to everyone who could see it. We are here, we are powerful, we are permanent. For hundreds of years, Monte Albán stood as the center of Zapotec life. Temples were built, rulers were buried in elaborate tombs, writing systems developed, some of the earliest known in the Americas, carved into stone with symbols that still challenge researchers today. And for a long time, the assumption was simple. The people who built this civilization stayed the same people, generation after generation. Isolated, unchanging. A single genetic story from the very first settlers to the descendants living in Oaxaca today. That assumption felt safe. It also turned out to be incomplete, because history left clues that didn't quite fit the simple story. Trade goods from distant regions, cultural influences that seemed to appear from nowhere, shifts in artistic style that didn't match a purely isolated society. Small inconsistencies, the kind historians often explain away because they don't fit the narrative already accepted. But ancient DNA doesn't care about narratives. It only tells you what actually happened. Now, if this idea of hidden ancestry is already giving you chills, imagine what it must feel like to be a descendant discovering this news about your own family tree. Take a second and imagine that, then keep watching, because this is where the story gets far more complicated. When researchers began analyzing ancient genetic material from the Oaxaca Valley, they weren't just hoping to confirm the timeline. They were hoping to answer a bigger question. Were the Zapotec truly one continuous population? Or was their history shaped by more movement, more mixing, and more change than anyone assumed? The evidence suggested something researchers didn't originally expect. Instead of one unbroken genetic line, the ancient DNA hinted at multiple waves of ancestry. Different populations arriving, blending, and shaping the Zapotec identity over thousands of years. Some genetic markers pointed to deep, ancient roots in the region. Others suggested connections to groups from farther away, arriving at different points in time. This didn't mean the Zapotec weren't truly the Zapotec. It meant their identity was built, not inherited, in one single unbroken thread. Built through contact, through movement, through blending with neighboring populations over generations. Think about what that really means. The people who built Monte Albán, who carved their language into stone, who created calendars and rituals and burial systems, were not the product of isolation. They were the product of connection, of exchange, of human beings moving, meeting, and merging over centuries. That idea changes everything. Because for a long time, ancient civilizations were often imagined as isolated bubbles, groups that grew alone, developed alone, and stayed untouched by outside influence until European contact centuries later. But that picture is starting to fall apart across many ancient cultures, not just the Zapotec. Human history, real human history, was never about staying still. It was about movement, migration, trade, marriage between distant groups, ideas traveling along footpaths and rivers long before recorded history began. And now, here's where the story gets even more emotional. Because ancient DNA doesn't just tell scientists about population movement, it tells them about individual human lives, real people, real choices, real journeys that we will never fully understand, but that shaped everything that came after them. Somewhere in that ancient valley, a person from a distant region met someone from the local community. maybe through trade, maybe through marriage, maybe through forced movement none of us can imagine today. And from that meeting, life continued. Children were born carrying two histories in one body. Generations passed. And eventually, an entire civilization carried the echoes of that ancient meeting without ever knowing the full story behind it. That's not just data. That's human history, written in blood and bone, silently passed down for thousands of years until modern science finally learned how to read it. If a single ancient meeting between two strangers could shape an entire civilization thousands of years later, doesn't that make you wonder what invisible stories are hiding in your own DNA? Sit with that question for a moment, then let's keep going. Because the deeper researchers looked, the more surprising the picture became. One of the biggest surprises came from comparing ancient remains to modern Zapotec populations living in Oaxaca today. Researchers wanted to know, how closely do today's Zapotec communities match the ancient people buried at Monte Albán thousands of years ago? The results showed something powerful and deeply human. Despite thousands of years of change, war, colonization, disease, and dramatic historical upheaval, many modern Zapotec communities still carry strong genetic connections to their ancient ancestors. This wasn't a story of total replacement. It wasn't a story of one people vanishing and being replaced by another. It was survival. Real, continuous, resilient survival across thousands of years of unimaginable change. Let that sink in for a moment. The Spanish colonization of Mexico brought devastating disease, violence, and cultural destruction. Entire populations were wiped out across the Americas in the centuries following contact with Europeans. Yet, in Oaxaca, deep genetic threads connecting modern Zapotec communities to their ancient ancestors still remain, according to researchers studying this population history. That is not a small thing. That is an act of survival written into the DNA of living people today. But here's where the story adds another layer of complexity. Because survival didn't mean isolation. It meant adaptation, blending, continuing forward while also absorbing new genetic influences over time, including, eventually, European ancestry following colonization. So the real story isn't a simple line from ancient to modern. It's something far more complicated and far more human. A story of deep roots mixed with new arrivals, of resilience combined with change, of identity shaped not by staying frozen in time, but by carrying the past forward while adapting to survive. This is where many people online started asking a bigger question. If ancient identity is this complex, this blended, this shaped by migration and mixing, what does that mean for how we think about ancestry and identity today? Some researchers believe this challenges older, simpler models of ancient civilizations as isolated, untouched societies. The evidence increasingly suggests that connection, not isolation, shaped ancient human history far more than previously assumed. Historians still debate exactly how much outside influence shaped early Zapotec civilization, and to what extent local development was the driving force behind their achievements. This isn't a settled argument. It's an ongoing scientific conversation, still unfolding as more ancient DNA samples are studied. But one thing becomes harder to ignore the deeper you look. The old idea of ancient civilizations growing in isolated bubbles, untouched by outside contact for thousands of years, is increasingly being challenged by genetic evidence across many ancient populations, not just in Mexico, but around the world. If you've made it this far, you already sense that this story is bigger than one ancient city. It's bigger than one valley in Oaxaca. This is really a story about how human identity itself has always been more complicated, more connected, and more surprising than the simple version we grew up believing. Before we go further into what this means for how we understand history itself, ask yourself this. If the story of your own ancestors was suddenly rewritten by science, would you want to know the truth, even if it changed everything you believed about yourself? Type your answer in one word in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how many of you would want to know. Now let's go deeper into why this discovery matters far beyond Oaxaca, because the Zapotec story isn't happening in isolation. Around the world, ancient DNA research has been quietly rewriting human history for the past 2 decades. Civilizations once believed to be isolated are turning out to be deeply connected. Populations once believed to be pure and unchanging are turning out to be blended, shaped by migration, trade, conflict, and unexpected human connection across vast distances. This isn't just a Mexican story. This is part of a much larger pattern in human history. Ancient Egyptians carried genetic connections to populations far beyond the Nile. Ancient Europeans were shaped by massive migrations from distant steppe regions thousands of years before written history. Ancient populations in Asia, Africa, and the Americas all show similar patterns. Movement, mixing, change. The idea of a pure, unchanging ancient bloodline is increasingly being challenged by science itself, and that raises an uncomfortable but powerful question. If ancient identity was never as simple as we assumed, what does that mean for the way modern nations, cultures, and even individuals define who they are today. For the Zapotec, this isn't just an academic question, it's deeply personal. Today, over 400,000 people in Mexico still identify as Zapotec, according to cultural and demographic estimates. Many still speak Zapotec languages, passed down through generations, despite centuries of pressure to abandon them. Many still practice traditions rooted in ceremonies that trace back to their ancient ancestors. For these communities, ancient DNA research isn't just rewriting distant history, it's reshaping the story of who they are, where they truly came from, and how their ancestors survived forces that tried, again and again, to erase them. Imagine being told your entire life that your ancestors were one unbroken bloodline, only to learn that your identity was actually built through connection, migration, and resilience across thousands of years. For some, that discovery might feel unsettling. For others, it might feel like an even deeper source of pride. Because surviving isn't just about staying the same. Sometimes surviving means adapting again and again while still carrying your ancestors forward. This is the layer most documentaries skip, the emotional weight behind the science. Because behind every genetic marker, behind every ancient bone sample, there's a human story of struggle, adaptation, and survival that deserves to be remembered, not just measured. Now here's where the mystery deepens even further. Because ancient DNA analysis doesn't just tell us where people came from. It can also reveal social structure. Researchers studying ancient burial sites in the Oaxaca Valley have found patterns suggesting that elite families, likely rulers and high-status individuals, sometimes show different genetic patterns compared to the general population buried nearby. This raises fascinating questions that researchers are still exploring. Were ruling families formed through strategic marriages with outside groups to build political alliances? Was genetic ancestry connected to power and status in ancient Zapotec society? Did ruling elites intentionally maintain connections with distant regions through marriage in order to strengthen trade and political relationships? These are the kinds of questions modern science is only beginning to answer, and the evidence suggests political marriage alliances, rather than simple isolation, may have shaped who held power in ancient Zapotec society. Think about that for a moment. Long before written diplomacy, before formal treaties, ancient rulers may have used marriage and bloodlines as political tools, binding distant regions together through family ties rather than military force alone. Power, it seems, was never just about armies. Sometimes it was about family connections, stretching across mountains and valleys, carefully built generation after generation. This adds a whole new dimension to how we imagine ancient civilizations. Not just isolated kingdoms competing for territory, but interconnected networks of families, alliances, and shared bloodlines shaping the political landscape of the ancient world. And this brings us to one of the most emotionally powerful parts of this entire story. Because ancient DNA research doesn't just uncover facts about the past. It reconnects living communities to their ancestors in ways that written history alone never could. For many indigenous communities across the Americas, including Zapotec descendants today, colonization didn't just bring physical violence. It brought a deliberate erasure of history, language, and identity. Records were destroyed. Oral traditions were suppressed. Entire generations were taught to be ashamed of their ancestry rather than proud of it. Ancient DNA research offers something incredibly rare in this context. Scientific proof of continuity. Proof that despite everything colonization tried to erase, the genetic threads connecting modern Zapotec communities to their ancient ancestors still remain, according to researchers studying this population's history. For descendants today, that isn't just an interesting historical detail. That's validation. That's proof that their ancestors survived, adapted, and passed life forward, generation after generation, against forces that tried to break that chain entirely. If you're someone who has ever felt disconnected from your own family history, or unsure of where you truly come from, this story carries a powerful reminder. Sometimes, the deepest truths about who we are aren't found in old documents or spoken stories. Sometimes they're written directly into our biology, waiting patiently to be discovered. Take a moment and imagine holding physical proof that your ancestors survived against impossible odds. That feeling, that sense of unbroken connection across thousands of years, is exactly what many Zapotec descendants are experiencing right now as this research continues to unfold. If this story is moving you the way it's moving me, share it with someone who has ever wondered about where their own roots truly come from. Some stories deserve to travel further than algorithms alone would ever take them. Now let's bring this story back to where it truly matters most. Because at the heart of all this science, all this genetic data, all these complicated migration patterns, there's a much simpler and more powerful truth. Human beings have never truly been isolated. Not the ancient Zapotec, not ancient Egyptians, not any civilization we've ever studied deeply enough. Human history has always been a story of connection, of movement, of people meeting other people, sometimes through peaceful trade, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through marriage, and slowly, generation after generation, becoming something new while still carrying pieces of everyone who came before them. The Zapotec were never a frozen, unchanging bloodline sitting quietly in one valley for thousands of years. They were something far more remarkable, a living, evolving civilization shaped by connection, resilience, and constant adaptation, yet still recognizably powerfully themselves across thousands of years of change. That's not a weaker story than the simple version we used to believe. That's a stronger one. Because it means survival was never about staying frozen in time. It was about carrying your identity forward, even while absorbing new influences, new connections, and new challenges along the way. And maybe that's the deeper lesson hiding inside this entire discovery. Identity was never meant to be a straight, unchanging line. It was always meant to be a living thread, woven from many sources, strong enough to survive contact, migration, colonization, and time itself, while still remaining unmistakably its own. The Zapotec people prove that resilience isn't about resisting change entirely. It's about surviving change, while still remembering who you are underneath it all. So the next time you look at an ancient ruin, a stone carving, or a forgotten language still spoken by a shrinking number of elders, remember this. Behind every ancient civilization is not a single frozen bloodline, but a living, breathing story of connection, survival, and quiet, unbroken resilience across thousands of years. And somewhere, right now, in a small community in Oaxaca, someone is speaking a language their ancestors spoke thousands of years ago, carrying forward a story that colonization, time, and history itself tried to erase, but never fully could. Some truths don't need to be shouted to be powerful. Sometimes they simply need to survive long enough for the world to finally listen.